All right, thank you. Thank you, Betty. Yeah, so tonight we have a very special program. You know, China has been in the news a lot lately in terms of its our trade relationships. So Ken is going to spend some time talking to us about that. Just a little background on Ken. Ken earned his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago, and he has a master's degree in government from the University of Virginia. He is president emeritus of the American University in Afghanistan and was professor of law and dean at the O.P. Jindal Global University in Sonipat, India from 2020 to 2023. Ken was recently appointed, as Betty pointed out, as chief of party for USAID's higher education project in Pakistan, and this program has been implemented by the University of Utah. He held previous academic appointments at the University of Wisconsin, University of Vermont, University of Memphis, Kansas State University, and Ball State University. He was a Fulbright professor at Tohoku University in Sendai, Japan, a Fulbright specialist at the Yangon School of Political Science in Myanmar, a research fellow at the Australian National University and University of Iowa, and visiting professor at University of Calgary. He managed higher education development projects funded by the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, U.S. Department of State, Eurasia Foundation, and USAID in Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Russia, Mongolia, Myanmar, and Cambodia. It's hard to keep track of all that. And he and his wife, Julie, are 2023 recipients of the Institute of International Education Centennial Medal for contribution in the field of international education. So Ken, with that, we're going to let you have a few comments, and then we'll ask a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for their questions. And those of you in the audience, if you have questions, when we get to that point, if you would send them to me, Ray Montagno, in the chat room, I'll change my name up there to Ray Montagno. Then I will keep track of the questions and call on you to ask your questions. So thank you very much. Ken, go ahead.
Thank you, Ray, for the kind introduction. So let me go ahead and share my screen.
Betty Tonsing.
Well, let me see here. It's not sharing. Okay, let me try that again.
All right, it looks like it's going now.
Can you see it? Says it's.
We're just seeing a black screen.
Oh, okay. Okay, let's try this again.
Ken, do you have what you wanted to share already up where you can see it?
Let's see here.
Because if you don't have it on your computer, you won't be able to share it with us.
Yeah, let me.
It says you're sharing.
Yeah, but he needs to have up on his own computer already set up what the PowerPoint he was showing us just before we started. Didn't Ken say he has two monitors?
No, he had it started up before. It should have worked.
Yeah, I had it working.
On the monitor you're looking at now? Was it on the monitor you're looking at now, Ken, or on your other monitor?
Let's see. I need to. I guess. Let me- Okay, so let's try it again. Sorry about that. Okay, let's try it again.
There we
There you
go.
go, great.
Okay, sorry.
All right.
So the topic is extremely important, China and U.S. trade rivalry. One of the biggest questions I think that Americans have right now about our foreign policy is, what is the future of Sino-American relations? And I like the way that Jonathan Chanis poses the question, is China a threat or an opportunity? So is China an adversary of the United States in the same way that Japan was in 1941 or the Soviet Union in 1962? That's one way to characterize China. Or does the prosperity of the United States depend on trade with and investment in China? And that's a whole different way of looking at the relationship. Or can China be both? Can it be both a national security threat and a business opportunity at the same time? So this means that the relationship between the United States and China is unique in our history. We've never had kind of a love-hate relationship at the same time with one country. Now, we need to have a little historical background to understand the current choices that we face. So if you go back to the Chinese Civil War between 1927 and 1949, between the Kuomintang or nationalists and the Chinese communists, the United States strongly supported the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek. But in 1949, the communists under Mao Zedong defeated the nationalist army, which with our assistance left the mainland and took refuge on the island of Taiwan across the Taiwan Strait. And so the United States treated China as just another communist nation, along with the Soviet Union. But in 1972, President Richard Nixon decided that we needed an ally against Soviet Russia. And so he normalized relations with China. And he visited China in 1972, and we normalized relations. We recognized the People's Republic of China as a legitimate government of China in 1979. So it was to obtain an ally against Soviet Russia that led to the warming of relations between our two countries. Here's a map of China, and you can see some important things to notice is China borders on the East China Sea here to the east, the South China Sea there on the south. You see the island of Taiwan just east of the mainland. China has been at war, communist China has been at war with its neighbors off and on, Russia, India, Vietnam, and of course, South Korea during the Korean War. So China, communist China has a history of military aggression. The most important change in, I think, the relationship between our two nations was as a result of the economic reforms instituted by Deng Xiaoping in 1976. And so he basically abandoned the Soviet style of command central planning, and he introduced the market into Chinese society. He introduced private property, including ownership of farms. He eliminated price controls by the government. He encouraged citizens to start their own businesses, and he began to attract foreign direct investment in Chinese businesses. So these are market reforms in a communist country, from a theoretical point of view, it doesn't make any sense at all, because under Marxist ideology, there should be common ownership of the means of production. But Deng Xiaoping, he abandoned the basic principles of Marxism and introduced market reforms. One of the things that the United States wanted to accomplish was to integrate an isolated China into the world trading system. And we were very successful in doing that. So in the early 1980s, China began to open its economy, signed a number of regional trade agreements. In 1986, China began to work toward joining the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which we set up at the end of World War II to encourage a free trade among countries. And the GATT became the World Trade Organization in 1995. China applied for membership in the WTO, but the United States blocked China's accession because we had a number of conditions that we demanded that China meet before we would allow their membership in the WTO. Some of the conditions included privatizing many state-owned enterprises, agreeing to engage in global competition according to rules, end restrictions on the service sector, including retail, wholesale, and distribution, open banking, financial services, insurance, and telecommunications to foreign investment, pass laws requiring transparency and protecting intellectual property, and lastly, establish a modern legal system to protect foreign investors. So this is where I enter the picture. In the 1990s, I was spending a lot of time in China, primarily implementing projects for the U.S. Department of Education. And I became very well known, especially in the city of Shenzhen. And I met the head of the local Communist Party in Shenzhen, which is the part of China bordering on Hong Kong. And when the U.S. blocked China's accession to the WTO and gave the Chinese this list of conditions, the Chinese Communist Party came to me and say, well, we know you well, and we were very, very interested in the book that you just published, comparing judicial systems around the world. So we would like you to help us comply with that last condition, help us establish a modern legal system. You wouldn't believe what existed in the 1990s in China. The judges were actually non-commissioned officers in the military. There were no juries. There were no defense attorneys. The prosecutors were also soldiers as well. There were more than 50 crimes that carried the death penalty. So basically, a criminal suspect was brought before one of these sergeants. The prosecutor would list out the charges against the defendant. The judge would look at the defendant and say, I find you guilty. He was then taken around the back of the building and shot in the back of the head. So that was Chinese justice. So I started from scratch, and I helped them establish a system of civilian courts, which they did not have, staffed by professional judges who had actually gone to law school. So I helped establish a system of law schools, civilian legal profession, civil and criminal procedure, dedicated and trained judiciary. They even asked me to design courtrooms, and I actually had them sit down and watch old Perry Mason episodes to see what a modern courtroom looked like. So it was a very challenging consultancy, but it was actually one of the most rewarding consultancies I'd ever undertaken. So China did meet U.S. conditions, and China was admitted as a member of the WTO in December of 2001. The party was so happy with me and my work that they invited me to the inner sanctum of Chinese Communist Party headquarters in Beijing, and we had a day-long celebration, which I'll never forget. Here's a photograph of the outside of the building. They said I was one of the few Americans who'd ever been invited into the inner sanctum. But so you can imagine how excited the United States was, with China's liberalization. Now, China has benefited immensely from the accession to the WTO, reduced barriers to trade, larger FDI inflows, boosted Chinese export markets. Tariffs on exports from China were reduced all over the world. China gained access to overseas markets it had been blocked from. Tariffs on imports into China were reduced. The number of state-run enterprises was reduced. Private businesses gained power and influence. Chinese entrepreneurs became very influential. Chinese international trade law became more transparent and more fair. And perhaps most important of all, over 400 million Chinese were lifted out of poverty. I remember when I first started traveling to China in the 1980s, poverty was widespread. No electricity, no running water in many villages. But within a few years, China became a very modern, advanced society with a large middle class. You can see what happened with China's exports. China became the factory, the world's factory. And you can see between 1980, 2020, China's share of the world's exports grew from almost nothing to nearly 20%. And you can see Germany's share, America's share, Japan's share, South Korea, all declined over that period. So China really is an export juggernaut. I think all of us have bought many, many products made in China. Now, we had high expectations. I certainly did that day that I was at the Chinese Communist Party headquarters, drinking Mao Tai. So WTO membership meant that China was joining this international trading system that we established, and was complying with rules, that we helped to make, governing international trade. The US-led system is open, rules-based, predictable, non-discriminatory. The WTO includes dispute settlement procedures when there's trade conflicts. There are protections for investors, protections for intellectual property. And many of us expected that these economic changes would result in political changes as well. And I remember going to several meetings in the 1990s and early 2000s on the development of democratic institutions in China, starting with local government. So the hope was that over time, these economic reforms would lead to political reforms, and that China would become a democracy that respects human rights, as happened in Taiwan. But everything changed in 2012 when Xi Jinping became the supreme leader of China. And he began a process which he continues today. He's a ruler for life now, just like Vladimir Putin in Russia. So he began enacting measures that were repressive, authoritarian, disrespectful of human rights. He cracked down on Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, on democracy in Hong Kong. And then in 2020, he also started cracking down on those wealthy entrepreneurs like Jack Ma. And he cracked down on private enterprise, including the technology sector, educational tutoring, real estate. Many of the current economic crises that China faces are due to his crackdowns on various sectors of the economy. He implemented a system of national surveillance They're the pioneers of facial recognition. Each citizen has something called a social credit account. And if you behave yourself and follow the rules and are a good citizen, then you get points, you get merits. If you are a bad citizen, then you get demerits. And merits and demerits determine whether you get a government job, whether you're allowed to buy an apartment. So the whole system of Big Brother government surveillance is in place, censorship of the press, political repression as well. I was in China the day that the government outlawed the Falun Gong, the religious group. And I remember seeing the police run into people's homes, bring out Falun Gong literature, throw it in the middle of the street and set it afire. And he also greatly increased spending on the military. You can see here that in 2022, the United States was the world's largest purchaser of military equipment and weapons, and China, however, was number 2. So the Chinese military budget is the second largest in the world, and you can see far, far larger than that of any other country. Look at the rate of increase in the Chinese military budget since 1990. Chinese military spending increased by 63% in the last 10 years. Our military spending has increased by less than 3%. We started from a larger base, but you can see that China's investing huge amounts of money in military hardware and weapons and technology and personnel. So what is Xi Jinping's vision for China's position in the world? And this is something we all need to think about. Xi Jinping is very clear. He wants China to displace the United States as the leader of the world. So that's clear. He then wants to reshape the US-led international system, basically wants to dismantle the post-1945 system that we established and replace it with his own system. He insists that international organizations, including the United Nations, no longer mention human rights or democracy as principles. He believes that China's rise is inevitable and that America's decline is inevitable. So he believes history is on China's side. He has in 2013 launched the Belt and Road Initiative, in which now more than 150 countries receive Chinese economic assistance to build infrastructure projects like dams and highways and airports and seaports. I'm going to Pakistan, as you heard. Pakistan is the largest recipient of Belt and Road Initiative funds from China. The projects are called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. China seeks to dominate the South China Sea and also the East China Sea, and also wants to reunite with Taiwan by force if necessary. Now, one of the most important questions that all of us, I'm sure, are asking is war between China and the United States inevitable? And there's a very interesting theory developed by Graham Allison, an American political scientist. And he says, if you look at history and you look at what happens when you have an established hegemon or dominant power, and then you have a rising power that's threatening that domination, then in the 16 instances that he studied, 12 of those conflicts ended in war. So 12 of those rivalries between a rising power and an established dominant power ended in war. And he quotes the historian Thucydides, who said that the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta in 431 BC was inevitable. because of the Spartans' fear of the growth of Athenian power. So Sparta was the established power, Athens was the rising power. So because of the rise of China, the military spending, the economic aggression of China, both Republicans and Democrats have reached a consensus in the United States that China is a threat. You first saw this with the administration of Donald Trump, who declared a trade war against China. Biden has been even tougher on China than Trump was. Biden has ramped up support for Taiwan. He pushed through the CHIPS and Science Act to prop up the U.S. semiconductor industry. He imposed controls on the export of semiconductor chips to China. And he's now, he hasn't done it yet, but he is promising to impose restrictions on Americans' ability to invest in certain technology sectors in China, including advanced semiconductors, quantum computing, and artificial intelligence. So President Biden says that in these areas, US investment simply makes the Chinese military stronger. And so it's not in the US interest to allow those investments. But he hasn't announced these rules yet. Now, so on the one hand, China is a threat to the national security of the United States, but there's a whole nother way of looking at China, and that is that China represents a business opportunity. And you can see the evidence of this everywhere you look. Look at who our top 3 trading partners are: Mexico, Canada, and China. So China is one of the top 3 sources of exports and imports. China's buying a lot of US made goods. We're buying a lot of Chinese goods as well. So from an economic trade point of view, China is one of the 3 most important trading partners of the United States. How about on the investment side? Many US companies are heavily invested in China. The Chinese market is one of the largest, it's the second largest market, second largest economy. Population 1.4 billion people, rising incomes, rising middle class, a consumer society. Look at just 2 companies, Apple and Tesla. They're the 2 most China exposed American companies. In 2023, 19% of Apple's revenue came from sales in China. 22% of Tesla's revenue came from sales in China. Apple builds its iPhones in China. Without China, Apple would, go out of business. In 2021, U.S. venture capital funds invested $45 billion in Chinese companies. So U.S. venture capital funds look to China as a great source of, emerging emerging businesses in which to invest. There are 252 Chinese companies listed on the U.S. stock exchanges with a market capitalization of more than $1 trillion. Probably many of us own stock in Chinese companies that we may not even know it because of our 401ks. Look, this is also very important. The U.S. Spends a lot more money. The U.S. government spends a lot more money than it takes in revenue. So we have to borrow money through the issuance of U.S. Treasury bonds. Of the $7.6 trillion of United States Treasury bonds, Japan and China hold the greatest portions, with China holding $770 billion in U.S. securities. One of the reasons why our inflation rate is as low as it is, around 3%, is because China is willing to purchase billions of dollars in U.S. Treasury bonds. You can see that Japan is the largest holder of Treasury bonds, but China is second just behind Japan. I came across this article in The Economist yesterday. McDonald's plans to open 1,000 burger joints in China this year, mostly in smaller cities outside of Beijing or Shanghai. The firm is doubling down on its second biggest market, even as many Western companies aim to de-risk from China. McDonald's wants to have 10,000 outlets in the country by the end of 2028, up from 5,500 now. So you can see for companies like Apple, Tesla, General Motors, McDonald's, China is extremely important. Venture capital funds like Sequoia Capital, China is essential to their profits. But as you can see, there's been a decline in recent years as a result of the friction, the Trump administration, trade war with China, Biden's hostility toward China. There's been a decrease in foreign direct investment in China from the United States and venture capital funds from China to the US. So this is definitely on the decline. So in conclusion, what's the answer to our question? Is China a national security threat, or is China a business opportunity for the United States? And I think the answer is it's both. It's a very unusual situation in the history of international relations. China represents both. The U.S. economy benefits greatly from access to this huge Chinese market. Some commentators have asked for decoupling from the Chinese economy, but if that were to happen, there would be very serious harm to our economy. The U.S. China trade relationship supports roughly 2.6 million jobs in the United States across many, many different industries. Many multinational corporations like Apple, Tesla, NVIDIA, venture capital firms, they depend for their success on access to the Chinese market. And as the article points out that we read, these companies are very, very influential on Capitol Hill and in the White House. They are very effective lobbyists, and they will lobby to weaken any attempt to limit U.S. investment, to limit the ability of American companies to do business in China. So whatever President Biden wheels out probably will be terribly weakened either from the beginning or later in the way it's implemented. So China is the world's most populous country, the second largest economy. Our prosperity in many ways is intertwined with theirs. So I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Ken. So if you could turn off your screen share, that'd be great.
Sure.
So for those of you who might have questions, as I said before, if you would send them to me and I will call on you in order to kind of ask your questions. So while you're doing that, I have a couple of thoughts I'd like to share maybe with Ken to get his response to them. So to a certain extent, you know, we have this conflicted relationship between China and the United States, and despite the fact that our economies are so intertwined. To what extent do we sort of overestimate China and, on the other hand, underestimate them? And maybe the same for them. Do they overestimate and underestimate some aspects of our existence?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ray. If we look at this question from China's point of view, I would say that Xi Jinping's belief that China's rise is inevitable and America's decline is inevitable, I think that's false. So he's much more confident in that scenario than the facts will support. So he's underestimating us and he's overestimating China. China faces many economic challenges right now. And then on our part, I think we underestimate his insistence on building a competitive military. He's now trying to see, one of the lessons that Xi Jinping has drawn from the war in Ukraine is that the United States will not go to war against any nuclear powered country. So he thinks then that if he can increase the number of nuclear warheads he has, that the United States would never ever go to war with China. But I think again he's underestimating us on that regard.
Interesting. So the article in our book was about this restriction of technology that may be used for defensive applications by the Chinese military. Is this a real problem, or is this more political posturing? It's kind of a get tough on China position.
Yeah, so President Biden, as you know, has implemented these export controls on the sale of advanced semiconductor chips, also the sale of machines that make semiconductor chips, but these controls are not likely to be very effective because it hurts not only U.S. consumers of Chinese-made chips and U.S. manufacturers of advanced chips. It hurts, but also hurts industries in our allied countries like the Netherlands, South Korea, Japan. It hurts our allies as well. And the other part of this issue is that China has shown its own ability by itself, without U.S. help, to make these advanced chips. For example, we were all shocked recently when Huawei announced that it had developed a 7-nanometer chip for use in its new cell phone. We didn't think they were capable of making a chip that small. So China has shown that it can create advanced technology, quantum computing, AI, advanced imaging. It can do this even without our assistance.
That was going to be a follow-up question that I had for you about that. So I've seen a number of articles recently about the belief, at least, that China has overestimated its economy in many cases, that regional economic statistics have been overinflated because regional governors and so forth don't want to be seen as failing the economic plans. To what extent is that true, or is this really an issue for kind of understanding the Chinese economy?
No, I think it's true, Ray. So the official Chinese statement is that their economy grew by 5% in 2023. But many American economists who have analyzed the data believe that the economy only grew by about 1.5% in 20. So the Chinese government is definitely inflating its growth figures.
So
yeah.
Okay, good.
Go ahead. I was just saying, you said local governments have an incentive to pass up inflated economic figures to Beijing.
Yeah. On kind of a related topic, what's the implication of the population bust that's looming in China? I've read a couple of different articles about that. Is that a significant issue for their long-term planning?
Yeah, it's a very serious issue. So the Chinese population is now starting to shrink. The number of deaths for the last 2 years has outnumbered the number of births. So, and that's one part of it. The other part is that there's this, because of the one child policy that was in place for so long, the number of elderly people is rapidly rising in China. And so you have this much smaller, cohort of young people because of the declining birth rate, and this much growing, ballooning cohort of elderly people. And so that's going to be a severe strain on the Chinese economy. because they'll have fewer consumers to consume Chinese-made products, and they'll have fewer workers to work in the factories.
Mhm. Which I think one of the articles I read was talking about actually the total global population is probably going to decline after 2000, after 2100 because of this declining birth rate. So
Yeah, in fact, if you extend the trends in both the U.S. and China, by the end of this century, we'll have the same population.
yeah.
Isn't that funny?
I think we'll go to a couple of questions from the audience. I have a couple more here, but I'll save them here. So Ann Kolb, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Good evening. Thank you so much. I wondered about the implications of China holding so many dollars in US bonds.
Yeah, so one of the obvious implications is that we are very reluctant to do anything to anger, China, because Xi Jinping could stop the purchase, of those U.S. Treasury bonds at any time. So it's a sort of an unstated hold that China has over us, but you can see that they're the second largest holder of these bonds in the world, and so they could definitely harm our economy. Our inflation rate would skyrocket if they were to stop purchasing those bonds, and if they were to sell them, flood the market with them, it would greatly reduce the value, of our bonds.
Has that been sort of threatened in sort of some of the negotiations? Or is that just something they kind of have in a back pocket?
Yeah, it's more of a back pocket thing because they're not ready to do that. They don't have is because they are an export economy. They bring in billions of U.S. dollars every year. They have to do something with those dollars, and so the most profitable use of those dollars is to buy U.S. Treasuries. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it? And that we buy products made in China. We pay U.S. dollars for those products. China then receives, the Chinese Treasury receives those dollars and then goes around and reinvest them in our own Treasury bonds. So that's how closely intertwined the two economies are.
It's a really interesting loop.
Yeah.
I have kind of a follow-up question to the last detail that you were talking about with the generation differences. Is the younger generation as on board with the direction that China is going, or is there a split in those maybe in generational ideals?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it brings up a very important phenomenon in China. It's called the social contract. So in China, people are willing to give up, basic freedoms like freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of the press. They're willing to give up these basic fundamental freedoms in exchange for economic opportunity and prosperity. And so that puts a lot of pressure on the Chinese Communist Party because the party has to perform in order to maintain the loyalty of these citizens. And what's happening is that with the slowdown in the Chinese economy, there's a much higher rate of unemployment. So, for example, the youth unemployment rate became so high last year that the Chinese government stopped publishing the statistics. And so there's a real danger that, especially young people who are unemployed, they'll lose faith in the government's ability to keep its promises. And that could be a source of not only social unrest, but even political unrest.
Sure.
All right. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you.
Mel Miller has a question.
Yes, thank you. Uh, what would be the impact on relations if President Trump were reelected and imposes the 10% tariffs that he's at least campaigning on? What impact would that have on the relations with China?
Well, as you know, Mel, he did launch that trade war, during his first administration, and it has had a dampening impact on, trade between the United States and China. But one of the things we've learned is that the people who suffer the most from these high tariffs on Chinese imports are U.S. businesses. For example, take an automobile. Think about how many parts go into a modern, automobile, and those parts come from all over the world. Many of them come from China. So it causes the price of an American-made automobile to rise even more. Tariffs on aluminum, on steel affect many, many different industries. So it looks like you're punishing China, but in reality, you're actually punishing American businesses. There are winners and losers anytime you raise tariffs. But President Trump is interesting in the sense that, he's an admirer of authoritarian personalities. He even was quoted when he was president saying, "We know Xi Jinping just made himself president for life. Maybe I should look at that." So my guess is that he'll want to cultivate good personal relationships with Xi Jinping. So that'll be a different dynamic than what we see now.
Okay, Larry, do you have a question? Oh, you're kind of breaking up, Larry. We can't hear you. We cannot hear you, Larry. Sorry. I think
We'll come back to Larry,
I
yeah.
know what his question is.
Yeah.
He wanted to know about the U.S. China Sister City program that Jim Banks had made a comment about. And what, if you have any thoughts about that whole issue? Are you familiar with it?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. So when President Trump, declared his trade war with China, it really changed the nature of the relationship. And so what you're seeing is a huge decline in the number of Chinese students in U.S. universities, a huge decline in the number of Chinese tourists coming to the United States. We saw the decline in Chinese investment in the U.S., and the sister city relationships have also suffered greatly. Also, Confucius Institutes, these were Chinese-funded institutes at U.S. universities to teach Chinese language and culture. Many universities have shut down those Confucius Institutes, and the sister city relationship is also suffering as well.
All right. It's actually kind of a local issue here in Carmel that came up the other day they had a sister cities meeting here in town, and this issue was discussed a little bit. The mayor was supportive of sister cities. So.
Oh, good.
Denise Franklin had a question.
Yeah, thank you. Can you discuss a little bit about how the COVID crisis either sped up or altered some of the trends that we've been seeing?
Yes. So what we saw was Xi Jinping exercising his authoritarian tendencies. Remember how he completely shut down, basically, the Chinese economy with these lockdowns during the COVID, and they were very severe. Very few international flights in and out of China, very few foreign visitors to China. People couldn't do business very easily, even within China. And so he actually hurt the Chinese economy, and we're actually seeing some of the long-term effects, of that, draconian lockdown. And then, if you remember, he suddenly released all those restrictions, just like overnight. And when he did that, there was a huge surge in deaths in China when people were exposed to the virus. And they had been so the way he handled it was really very harmful to the Chinese economy, and we're seeing the impacts of that now.
All right, thank you. Just as a reminder, if you have a question, you can send it to me in the chat room there. So one issue that's come up a lot is the whole issue of cyber crime and industrial spying. China appears to be a major player in that, state-sponsored industrial spying and cybercrime. How does this affect their position in the world as a potential global leader?
Yeah, so for a long time, the United States, has accused China of engaging in, unfair trade practices, forcing U.S. companies that want to do business in China with transferring their intellectual property to China, asking graduate students at U.S. universities to spy for China. Not giving American companies the same access to the Chinese market that Chinese companies have to the U.S. market. So it has a bad reputation, obviously, in the world of international trade, but U.S. companies have learned to live with all that. So, for example, the Chinese usually require a U.S. company that wants to do business in China to have a joint venture with a Chinese company. The Chinese company typically learns how to make something like an electric vehicle from Tesla, for example. It learns how to do it and gets the patents, from the U.S. company, and then it ends the joint venture and goes off and makes its own products. So Chinese electric vehicle companies, Ray, are now beginning to dominate the world market. But they learned how to do that from Tesla.
Yes, I'm an EV fan myself, so I've been I pay attention to that, and I noticed that Chinese company, can't think of the name of it.
BDY.
Yeah, BDY.
BDY. And guess who owns huge shares of BDY? Warren Buffett.
Oh, yeah. Well, I see that they've now taken over the #1 slot as the largest producer of electric vehicles in the world. So,
yeah.
So, wanted to talk a little bit about Taiwan. Obviously, we hear a lot about Taiwan in the news. Taiwan is sort of the chip capital of the world. Is this an underlying driver for China to get the chip technology? And the fact that the CHIPS Act passed here in the United States, and we're absorbing some of that technology back from Taiwan, is this sort of part of the urgency that China feels about Taiwan?
Yeah, so it looks like it should be one way, but it's actually the other way. So I'll explain. So as you pointed out, Taiwan produces about 90% of the world's advanced semiconductor chips. So 90% come from Taiwan. And Taiwan dominates the whole chip manufacturing industry. But it's using U.S. technology, like the chips themselves are designed in the U.S., but they're actually made. So Taiwan is the manufacturer. They're the fabricator of the chips. They're not the designers of them. So if China were to take over Taiwan, it would be a complete bust because the Taiwan chip makers would have to stop production because the U.S. would not allow, if China were to take over Taiwan, the U.S. would not allow U.S. companies, to provide the designs and the advanced technology and the machines that Taiwan needed. So the whole Taiwanese chip industry would collapse if China were to seize Taiwan.
Interesting. Just a little anecdote here. I visited the chip plant in Kokomo many years ago. That was Delco Electronics ran, and at the time they were telling me that um, they made chips at a loss, but they wanted to keep the technology and the know-how to make them at least in-house. And I think that strategy lasted about 10 years, and they finally gave up. And so GM doesn't make any more chips anymore. So, but anyhow, just a little side story there. Betty, you had a question. You're muted.
I also have a question about Taiwan, a different one, but to piggyback on the chip. You know, at Purdue University, they're putting a $1.8 billion chip manufacturing facility at Purdue, but down the road in Lebanon, and this has become a really ugly controversy. And Purdue is because Purdue wants to create that what they call the corridor between Lafayette and Indy, and there's Lebanon is just right down the road. They're going to be creating like I don't know, 40 billion, if not bigger, $1 billion chip manufacturing facility in anticipation of what may happen with the Taiwan situation. This would be happening, I'm sure, other parts of the country, and they want to tap out the water from them. Well, the controversy is they need water, lots of it, and they want to take it from the Wabash, but it will not come back to Tippecanoe. So there's a big stink over whose water is it anyway, but it's so we are anticipating a possible loss by starting to possibly replace making our own chips. And Purdue will be, as other schools will be helping to lead that way. My question to you, Ken, with that though, with Taiwan, is should China carry through its threat? I don't know whether you can share your position or not, or if you want to. I'm rather partial to Taiwan. My children are Taiwanese. We have a good relationship. They're allies in many ways. China's one of our largest trading partners. Chips aside, what we talk, don't do it, China, and yet we say we won't really engage in a war. How valid is a threat that the Chinese know isn't going to be covered by any military support? And how far should we go?
Yeah, so
that support Taiwan.
Yeah, that's a good question, Betty. So historically, in 1979, the United States shifted its recognition from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China. So Taiwan is in this kind of odd no man's land,
Right.
where
That's right.
the Kuomintang claims to be the government of all China, but only I think now 13 countries recognize the Republic of China as the legitimate government of Greater China. And so what the U.S. has done, because Taiwan is a democracy and has a free market and is a very important trading partner, what the United States has done is to they supply large amounts of weapons to Taiwan. So Taiwan is a very formidable enemy. So if China were to try to seize Taiwan, it would be quite a major fight, and it's not clear that China would even win. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's been a change. Before President Biden, no U.S. president would say openly, if China attacks Taiwan, we will come to Taipei's defense. But 4 times President Biden has stated that. So he's the first U.S. president to state that the U.S. would come to the aid. The problem is the closest U.S. troops, the closest U.S. base is in Okinawa, which is 400 miles away.
Yeah. What does that realistically look like? Because we've also made it clear we aren't going to really fight. Like, we're giving you aid to Ukraine, but we'd rather not have our boots there. But if Putin succeeds and invades NATO, of course we know what will happen. But there's no such CETO sort of arrangement that covers that. So what really do we mean? We'll come to your aid and defense with words?
Well, if it's a naval and air war, then you can fight it with missiles.
Hmm.
So you don't have to have boots on the ground if you're destroying ships and airplanes. You can
And
do
what would
that from a
China
long
do?
distance.
They have missile capability, do they not?
Sure. Yeah, they would use them as well. Yeah. But it wouldn't be
So we'd
boots on the
be,
ground. Yeah.
yeah, but I mean, China then would be sending their missiles as well at us.
Yeah, and because they're a nuclear power, they could launch ballistic missiles to the U.S.
Yes.
mainland. Yeah. But
Hmm.
see, Xi Jinping is calculating that the U.S. government would not do that.
Yeah.
So he thinks that the possession of nuclear weapons is a deterrence against a U.S. Military response.
All right, thank you. Claire Collins, I think you had a question. You're muted.
Yes, I'm not muted now, right?
Okay.
Okay. I was interested in the healthcare for the average Chinese. Is that something that's supplied by the government coffers? And also, is China sharing their newfound prosperity with the countries of the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah, those are two good questions, Claire. The first one is very interesting. I'm glad you brought it up because Xi Jinping detests the welfare state. He says that welfare, the social safety net, makes people weak. And so he doesn't, there's no social security system. There's no government aid, to the elderly or the poor. So he insists that the families take care of the elderly, for example, or the sick. And so there's no welfare state. It's kind of interesting. It's a communist country, but it's basically every family for itself. And then your second question, Claire, was what was the second question?
Is China sharing their prosperity
Oh.
with the Belt and Road Initiative? Are they mimicking China, or are they just letting them bulldoze over them?
Yeah, so Xi Jinping, this was his baby, his idea, the Belt and Road Initiative. So he primarily sees it as a way to advance Chinese influence around the world. So he goes into a developing country like Pakistan, and the Chinese engineering firms build huge amounts of infrastructure, highways and bridges and airports, seaports, all kinds of power plants, a lot of electricity generating plants. They build all this massive infrastructure, telecommunications, but they don't do it for free. So they give loans to these developing countries. And so many of these countries have overborrowed. A good example is Sri Lanka. They borrowed money under the Belt and Road Initiative from China to build a new port, Hambantota, in Sri Lanka. And they were going to repay the loan from the revenues generated by the port, but they weren't generating enough revenue. They couldn't repay the loan. So they actually gave the port to China. So China now operates it. And you can see, Claire, what China does is it gains access to strategic locations within these countries. This Belt and Road Initiative involves more than 150 countries: Africa, Latin America, Asia. And so there's a Chinese presence and a growing Chinese military presence in these areas. So from a strategic point of view, he's using this initiative to not only gain influence over these developing countries, but also to expand the footprint of the Chinese Navy and Chinese Air Force as well.
And don't they supply the workers are actually Chinese, and it doesn't really contribute to the economy of these countries. These countries have a high unemployment rate still, probably.
Yeah, so usually the beneficiaries of this Chinese money are the elite in those countries. Remember, these are countries with weak states and weak legal protections. So there's a lot of corruption. So a lot of the Chinese money goes into the pockets, of the dictators. And you're right that most of like the engineering work will be done by Chinese engineers. When I'm in Pakistan, the Marriott Hotel is full of Chinese, and they're because they're there as engineers, technicians. Though some of the manual labor, of course, is done by the local workforce, but there's lots of complaints about the way they're treated. And also the China demands that they have access, to the top levels of government. And so you can look at many of the countries in Africa and in Latin America as well, where the foreign policy of these countries is often, shaped by China.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Denise Franklin had another comment.
Yeah, I have read recently some comments from African nations that even the quality of work that's being done in these projects is substandard, half done in many cases.
Yeah, if you look at the Belt and Road, the Belt and Road Initiative is 10 years old. And if you look at the projects that were included in that plan, many of them are unfinished. They were either never started or they're not completed yet. And you see that all over the world. Yeah, I see it in Pakistan, for example. And then another problem is that right now the Belt and Road Initiative has not made money for China. And so actually Xi Jinping is in the process of kind of refashioning it. So from one point of view, yes, it's been a great success because they built, billions of dollars worth of infrastructure. But many, as you said, many of the projects are unfinished. And of more concern, I think, to many people is that these Chinese do not follow normal environmental protections. So there's huge amounts of environmental damage done by these projects: water pollution, air pollution, destruction of ancient structures. Also, they don't respect the local customs of people. And so there's no respect, for local religions and local cultures. So that's also often used as a criticism against the BRI.
Kind of an opinion piece after follow up on this question. What should be the U.S. response to this? I mean, what is, we have the AID and so forth, USAID, and is that our response? Or what else can we be doing?
Yeah, so actually President Biden and the G7, they take this Chinese initiative very seriously. So they actually launched in 2021 a competitor infrastructure development project called Build Back Better World, Build Back Better World. And so the U.S. and the other members of the G7, UK, Canada, Germany, et cetera, they're all putting money into a pool. And the big difference in between the Build Back Better world and the BRI is the U.S. led program relies on private investment, whereas the Chinese program these projects are built by Chinese state-owned enterprises, and the money goes to usually state-owned enterprises in the developing countries. So it has a very heavy, government hand, whereas the U.S. provides incentives to private companies to build infrastructure. So it's still early. It's only 3 years old. So, but the U.S. is putting more and more money into this program.
All right, thank you. Yeah, Betty, go ahead.
Also following up with that, as I understand it, one of the things that many countries found attractive for the Belt and Road Initiative over our decades of USAID investment and partnership was that ours always came with a caveat of human rights, that we would have a partnership with a country that while we were doing the support, they would have to do more to address human rights. And China was coming in saying, who cares? Yeah, do what you want. Now, we've been talking about this over the years in different programs in Africa and Latin America. Are the countries still welcoming? You mentioned now a few of the erosions, unfinished projects and cultural indifference and so forth. And of course, the treatment when they do use people as laborers, as manual laborers. Are the countries beginning to, they really like that idea that they could continue doing their own corrupt whatever and human rights practices, abuses. But are they now getting tired of this? And are they beginning to think maybe USAID wasn't so bad? And of course, the German aid and British aid and other Western country aid, are they reconsidering this, you think, or what do you see?
Yeah, so the developing countries themselves, you're right, they would say, I would rather have Chinese money than, say, World Bank money,
Yeah.
because World Bank money comes with many conditions.
Yeah.
Like my project, my USAID project in Pakistan, it has a gender component, it has environmental component. So respect for human rights, respect for diversity, religious freedom, those are all built into all World Bank, IMF, USAID, again, Australia, AusAid, Australia Aid, UK Aid, all the Western countries put these human rights, diversity, equity, inclusion. They put all of those requirements, protection for the environment. Those are all conditions that go with aid from these G7 countries and international financial institutions. So some, dictators in Africa and other continents, they say they'd rather have the Chinese money because it comes with no conditions.
Yeah, I was underscoring that, but I'm asking that having had this relationship now, and as they see unfinished projects, and as they see China's own corruption at play, as they see an indifference to the culture, as they see the treatment perhaps that they care at all about the manual labor, and as they see an indifference even to them, China's there for one thing, that is China. They care to. Are they now thinking, this really may not have been so worth it? And of course, the first loan you don't pay back, like in the case of Sri Lanka, you not only have your bridge, you don't really have the bridge you have it in your country, but you don't own it. You're not going to own any money that's going to come from it, any revenue. It's ours because you missed one too many payments. My question is, are the countries now rethinking that maybe it wasn't such a great idea, and they're going to be more open now perhaps to USAID and other Western aid?
You might think that, Betty, but my experience is no. For example, in Pakistan, it's a good example. I've been visiting Pakistan quite a bit, and of course now I'll be living there. But one of the things I've noticed when you talk to Pakistani intellectuals, they're very pro-Chinese for the most part. So they really they seem grateful to China for the investment. So I don't think there's the only country that's withdrawn recently from the BRI is Italy. Italy was the only NATO country that was a member of the BRI, but recently, the last few months, it withdrew. But Italy's not a developing country. But if you look at Latin America, Africa, Asia, I don't see them turning away from China at all.
All right. I kind of want to go back a little bit to China's domestic market. One of the things that's happening with the reshoring of industries back to the United States, and I presume to Europe to a certain extent, can China grow its domestic market sufficiently to kind of make up for this loss of a foreign investment and so forth?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ray, because again, if you look at this question in first light, it looks like the answer would be yes, that China could build up its consumer economy. China could invest in its own domestic companies and build a consumer society based on internal consumption. But that's not at all what's happening. What's actually happening is that Xi Jinping has decided to invest heavily in emerging technologies. So artificial intelligence, green technology. China is the largest producer of solar panels by far. Wind turbines. China is the biggest producer of wind turbines. Quantum computing, artificial intelligence. So he's investing heavily in these emerging technologies because he knows that China will be able to produce products, employing these technologies at very high quality and at a lower cost than the U.S. and other Western countries. So he's gambling right now. He's gambling that he can regrow the export economy, and so he's taking a gamble on that. We saw that there's been a decline in foreign investment in China. He thinks he can reverse all that with these new technologies.
Yeah, interesting. We have one more question I want to ask you here, and then we'll wrap up for the evening. But the obviously the Middle East has been high on everybody's radar recently. What is China's role in sort of shaping policy in the Middle East? Occasionally you hear about China intervening in some discussions with Iran and Saudi Arabia. What do they see happening there?
Yeah, so China's purpose is to weaken the United States. In order for Xi Jinping to realize his global vision, then the position of the U.S. in the world, has to decline. So if the Arab world turns against the United States because of its support of Israel, then that helps, further Xi Jinping's vision. So he wants China to, take the position of a friend, to all developing countries, a friend to, all, people who he always talks about a rising tide lifts all boats. He talks about common shared prosperity around the world. So he definitely has a message that would appeal to the Arab population, and he wants to be seen as their friend. So that, and he wants the U.S. to be embroiled as many conflicts as possible, because that again weakens the U.S.
So that's interesting in terms of his decision making about Russia as well. I haven't heard anything about that in the news lately about China's support of Russia. Is that still kind of under the radar, or are they actively supporting them?
Yeah, so Xi Jinping does not want to ensnare China in any of the sanctions imposed by the United States on Russia. So he's extremely careful that he doesn't do anything, because again, if it's an export economy dependent on foreign investment, and you saw how China is integrated into the international trading system, sanctions would hurt China more than any other country. So he's very, very careful. But at the same time, trade between China and Russia has grown dramatically since the war in Ukraine broke out. And China is buying oil from Russia, and Russia is gaining access to, for example, through North Korea. So China supports North Korea. North Korea then supplies, weapons to Russia. So China is working through proxies, but it's definitely buying lots of oil and natural gas from Russia.
All right. Well, okay, I think our time is about up here for the evening. I really appreciate your presentation tonight. It was very, very interesting. And I hope you have a great visit to Pakistan. You're going to be there for 2.5 years, I understand.
That's right, yes.
So
Yeah, we're gonna miss you, Ken.
really, what exactly does the project entail there?
Sorry, was the question right?
Exactly is the project in Pakistan going to entail?
Oh, yeah. So U.S. Agency for International Development is trying to reform the Pakistani economy to make it more of a market economy. And one of the areas where there's a big gap is between the skills that university graduates have and the skills that employers are looking for. So there's a very high youth unemployment rate in Pakistan, and then multinational corporations and Pakistani companies can't fill their positions because they can't find qualified workers. So this project is designed to change the whole system of higher education. It's very ambitious. Change the entire system of higher education in Pakistan to make it more market centered and more sensitive to the needs of employers. And that means changing curriculum, changing teaching methods, forming partnerships between industry and universities. So it's a very ambitious project.
All right.
And it's a 2.5 year or 5 year project?
Well, actually, it's a 5-year project,
Yeah.
but I was brought in because the former chief of party left the project.
Oh, okay. So has that already been underway for 2.5 years?
Yeah, it started in 2021.
So are they on their way? Is it,
Well, yeah,
are these initiatives and reforms underway? Are they showing some early success?
Yeah, in fact, it's funny you say that because
Yeah.
one of the things that we're doing right now is polling the universities we've been working with, and to say is what tell us some success stories.
Yeah.
So we'll be actually publishing those success stories soon.
Well, thank
Yeah,
you.
Ken, yes, thank you. Ken will know. George and I, my husband and I, we also worked with various USAID initiatives, including an educational. And it just cracks me up because, and we go in with huge hearts, a lot of money, into these ancient cultures that, 5 years going to, and of course, so much is rooted in culture and people. And it's so have a lot of fun, Ken. I know you will. So we're going to miss you, and we're going to miss having you and Julie around and coming. We're going to miss you at parties, but we're going to particularly miss you at presentations because, Ken, whenever you come and offer us a presentation, it's always excellent. I want to thank you very much for opening our program season with this. It was wonderful, wonderful program. And so I can tell in people's expressions that have their cameras on, they agree with me. So thank you very much. You're going to let us know when you're going to be in country for those occasional leaves, because if we happen to be having a program before our program season, maybe we can slide you in on something. Actually, do stay in touch with us, because if there's something that you can share with us of strategic importance, because that's what we do, timely, urgent topics, how they intersect with the United States, in Pakistan and in that part of the world, let us know, because that could be very interesting. And of course, it's always possible, because of the world of virtual programming, that you're talking to us at 4 o'clock in the morning. What would 7 o'clock our time be in Pakistan?
It would be 5 o'clock in the morning.
Well, you can do it. You're a young guy. You can do it. You can always take a nap later. That's always the option. If this evening's program interested you, because China is, what does China not impact? What has China never impacted? As you were talking, I was thinking about it for centuries, millenniums, but centuries, China dominated as a dynasty. And when I talk about this with my own students in global studies and different courses, you take a look at that Eastern influence, and of course the trade, just the beginning of trade and globalization, came from China, and all the things that they invented, all the gunpowder, the wars in Europe centuries later, China, the compass, so that Portugal and Spain could go out and navigate and colonialize and imperialize China, and then the Ming Dynasty, they drew back and they withdrew, and so the current leadership is very aware they would like to go out and dominate again. They have long memories. But China will be dominating many of our programs indirectly. Next week, again, is the High Seas Treaty. I do believe China shares a sea. So I'm sure that what we're talking about is who navigates and who governs our waterways. What is the governance system? That would be a very good one. Please sign up. Climate change would be very good. You were just mentioning this evening that when they go in, they don't pay too much attention to environmental standards and regulations. And so I'm sure that there's not a lot that we can do about impacting the world's climate if China is not in agreement. The Middle East realignment, China is keeping an eye on what's going on in the Middle East. as what's going on in Russia as to what they might do with Taiwan. Science across borders will very clearly center a lot around China and the collaborations between laboratories because of COVID. Understanding Indonesia, NATO's future, I'm sure China will feature, and pandemic preparedness ends our season. No doubt China will be mentioned again. So if you are all interested in China, stick with us throughout our season here at Great Decisions, because China and the US and Russia always seem to be those critical players. And so I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Just bear in mind that when you sign up for the programs going forward, what night you're signing up for, because we're not just doing them on one particular night of the week any longer. We want to get our speakers when they could come. And it helped us an awful lot to kind of navigate that. So we just have to help remind you that it's not always going to be every Thursday or every Tuesday. The nights will change and maybe the time. I think Science Across Borders will be at 6 o'clock, for example, because he will be talking to us at 2 o'clock from Sweden. And he said, I can do 2. I'm pretty dead by 3 a.m. So we thought, okay, we'll move it up. And of course, Indonesia will be at 11:30. So please, please, we don't want to lose you. We don't want to lose you. We want you to stay with us. We don't want to lose you because of a misunderstanding about a day or a time. Thank you again for joining us. We'll see you next week. If you can consider becoming a member, we very much welcome you. So thank you for joining us this evening. And we'll see you next Monday at 7 o'clock to talk about the high seas. Bon voyage to you, Ken. We'll see you soon. Good night, all.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you, Ann.
So Ken, how do they ship your dog? How does that?
Yeah, so Emirates Airlines told us just to consider him as passenger baggage, personal baggage. So he'll be in a kennel in the hold of the plane, but for legal purposes, he's considered our personal baggage.
So
But we have to be on the same plane.
Got to be in a
Okay,
temperature controlled space, though, right?
Oh yeah, they have a place for animals in the hold. Yeah, yeah, it's temperature control.
oh. Now, will you tranquilize him or something for the flight, or?
Yeah, he'll be in the care of a vet.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah, so the
for lack
vet
of a
will
better
take care
word.
of him.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Jerry, how you doing? Jerry, how's it going?
Gary's thinking, do I hear my name?
Well, I'm going to take off. Good to see you.
All right.
I'm going to tell
Betty,
you real
Ray.
quick. I'm going to tell you real quick, Ken. Ken, real quick, when we moved from Indiana to Oregon, we had 3 cats. No, just 2. We came back with 3. And I had taken the cats with me when I went on was home on a leave. I went ahead with the job, and the kids were finishing semester of school, and I took the cats back with me. We had bought a house, and I wanted to get them acclimated to the house. And I think I had them in one large carrier, because they grew up together very close. And I went to go get them at wherever you retrieve the animals. And all I know is I heard this howling, just this howling, and people going, God, who owns that animal? And I thought it was the one cat who was our more active cat. It was actually the one that was very silent. But I swear to God, you would have thought that somebody was twisting that cat's body or tail. It was just howling like crazy, angry as all get out. And you could tell the people were like, get that thing out of here. And I got into the cab and it wouldn't stop howling. I was afraid to put my hand in there. I wasn't sure because they were really my daughter's cats. So I just opened the door when I got to the house and so I hope that your dogs don't, well, I just hope your dog doesn't spend the entire flight hauling. But if it's taken care of by a vet, perhaps not. So
Yeah, well,
good
he flew from Afghanistan
Yeah.
to Chicago, so
but
he's
he may not remember that. He may not remember that.
yeah.
A while. Well, good luck to you. Godspeed.
Okay, thank you.
Good night, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Hey, Janet. How you doing? All right. I'm going to end this. Good night to all.